Hi, I'm Ian Palmer, and I've been playing drums now for 30 years. During that time, I've had the great fortune of playing in a variety of different styles of music. My background is in jazz music. That's where I started off. I'm a student originally of the great drummer Joe Morello in New York. A little while ago now, actually, but Joe was fantastic. One of the great technical masters of the instrument. From there, as I said, I've worked with various different pop groups, different jazz groups, various sessions, and brings us right up to present day. Very recently, I was working in Los Angeles with the great producer, arranger Richard Niles for the new Bandzilla album, which is a band of session musicians from the London area from the 80s, actually. So I'm following in the footsteps of quite a few interesting drummers and some great guest artists. So I'm looking forward to the release of that record. That's been the latest thing. And it's great to be here.
Fantastic. And you mentioned that you worked with one of my real kind of heroes, Peter Erskine. He taught you at some point, is that correct?
Peter, I was a student of Peter's, yeah. I mean, in my early years, my father actually encouraged me to, in fact, no, my uncle, who was a drummer originally, said to my father, the best thing that Ian can do is study with some of the best people, learn from the best people. And that was at the age of 14, 15, exactly what I did. As I mentioned, Joe Morello was one of my teachers, but Peter Erskine was is a huge influence on me. He's amazing. Peter played with the band Weather Report, Steps Ahead, Joni Mitchell, Steely Dan, a great pedigree. And, just to be in the presence of somebody like that is inspiring. He's fantastic.
Brilliant. And what piqued your interest to play the drums? Was it because of your uncle?
Well, I have two uncles that play. One of them is Carl Palmer, who played in the band Emerson, Lake and Palmer in the 70s. And my other uncle is Steve Palmer, who was the resident drummer at Ronnie Scott's Club. When it was in Birmingham, actually, he was a fantastic jazz drummer. So I didn't really have a choice, did I really? I was always going to be a drummer with two drummers in the family. And my dad was there was three brothers. There was Steve, who was the youngest, Carl, the middle brother, my late father was the oldest. And there was always music in my family. My dad was a semi-professional guitarist as well. He enjoyed that. So there's always been music. So yeah, drums was very natural.
One of the great pleasures of working with Spitfire has been I've got to meet a real host of drummers, and the one thing I notice is that you're all very sweet-natured people, and I have a theory it's because you've got very laid-back parents, because drums are a very loud instrument. How do people get around? How do you get to practice the drums when you're a kid in a house? This must be quite a blocker to many people wanting to learn the drums.
No, you're absolutely right. My parents were very tolerant. I had a full set of drums like this, and what I used to do is we used to put tea towels and blankets inside the bass drum and mute the drums as much as possible, because we didn't have the practice kits that we have today. And I didn't really know what I was doing. I was just bashing along with records, which actually turns out was fantastic way to learn. But I remember the neighbours coming around complaining, well, it's Sunday afternoon. Well, Ian, just kind of keep the noise down. It's just Sunday afternoon. My dad was like, I can't hear anything. They were so supportive. I mean, I'm blessed to have parents that really help me with my career.
Before we start talking about the mechanics of the kit itself, obviously there are quite a lot of electronic kits that I imagine kids are encouraged to play. They're a very different beast, though, aren't they, to an actual real drum kit?
That's a really, really good question. It's something which is really pertinent to my activities now as a musician. I've been asked on several occasions, actually, to play electronic drums on a recording. And I've got a theory about it personally. Now, this set of drums here, which is a fantastic state-of-the-art Yamaha drum set, are precision-made, beautiful, handmade drums. The problem I have with the electronic drums is that we're so used to hearing music these days so precise and so exact, digital music, basically, ones and zeros, on or off. It's very difficult for a human being, I think, to reproduce that. And why would you want to reproduce that kind of sound on an electronic drum kit played live? So, one of the things I always say, if you want electronic drums, I prefer the sound of them programmed. You can do some interesting things with programming. For me, acoustic drums are played by humans. Electronic drums, for me, are played by digital sequencers.
Brilliant. Now, whilst we understand that no drum kit is the same, the kind of the recognisable shape of a drum kit is something that's, to me, strikes me as something that's clearly defined. But when doing a little bit of research about this, we're not talking about even 100 years. So could you talk us through the genesis of the drum kit and where the different components come from?
Well, firstly, when we just talk about me as a drummer and what I put across and what I do, for me, I'm a great detective. I've really looked back to the history of the drum set. And if we trace it back to people like Baby Dodds in like the 1920s, Dave Tuff, these people were pre-Buddy Rich. These are the people who really defined the drum set the way it is, today, the forefathers of the instrument. We went back to, the invention of the hi-hat cymbal, back to the jazz days. Originally, it was called a sock cymbal, and there was just a snare drum. There was a big 30-inch bass drum. There were wood blocks, as I think we mentioned earlier on, we used to call the drums traps then. In fact, if you go back to the birth of Buddy Rich, who was a child star, he was known as Traps, the Drum Wonder. And that's what the drum set was known as back then. So then, it's a very long story. You can trace it chronologically over the years. And, this is where we are today. This is a modern drum set. There was one of my great heroes, Steve Smith, fantastic drummer, did a video, actually, DVD, called The History of the Modern Drum Set. And he discusses every different style and where we are today. A lot of guys today, at one stage, everybody wanted to sound like Buddy Rich. They had a drum setup like Buddy Rich, which was very specific, actually, with one rack tom, two floor toms, the ride cymbal, the two crashers. And there are a lot of what we call, clones, people who copy that style. Fast forward to the studio age, the great Steve Gadd, who was another game changer, had a totally different setup, which wasn't dissimilar actually to this setup in front of me today. Everybody at one point wanted to sound like Steve Gadd, and he brought something else to the instrument. At the same time as well, you just go slightly left field. You've got Billy Cobham, who brought something else technically in the fusion era of the 70s. And then you fast forward again into the 80s. Dave Weckl again brought something else, and he had a slightly different setup as well. And then today, the guys that everyone loves today, Keith Carlock, Steve Jordan, the great groove players, they've got their own thing. So everybody throughout history has brought their own little take on the modern drum set and made it what it is today. I personally, from my point of view, as an artist, a drum set artist, I try and take a little bit of everybody, put it into the melting pot, and hopefully, it comes out sounding like Ian Palmer. It's not as if I'm trying to play something which Steve Gadd has played, because there's only one person who plays as good as Steve Gadd, and that's Steve Gadd. So, it's great. This is an art, isn't it? It's not a competition. This is for everybody to enjoy. It's subjective. And the art of drumming is something which, I hope progresses, and who knows where we'll be in the next 50 years with it.
That's brilliant. So why don't we go round the kit, talking about the individual drums, where they come from, how you play them. And then at the end, we can talk about how you put it all together, really.
Sure.
So I think the most logical way for me to do it would be as you would have it on a mixing desk. So should we start with the kick drum?
I'm glad you said that as well. Start with the kick drum, exactly. And that, for me, is exactly where everybody should start. One of the things when I was learning to play drums is I had no bottom end in my playing. No real kind of, you look at all the great players throughout history, they've got a very good balance of the drum set. And one of the things which is really pertinent is the bass drum. Steve Smith said something interesting about the bass drum. You look at the great photographs of the great jazz drummers back in the day, Buddy Rich, Gene Krupa. Interesting, look at their hands. Where are they facing towards? They're all facing towards the bass drum. That was the thing that anchored everything. That was the real bottom end that really got underneath the big band or the band that they were playing with at the time. So for me, the bass drum is absolutely critical to the whole mix of the instrument. We talk about the modern drum set today. A lot of those great players go back to John Bonham. So much bottom end in his playing. Led Zeppelin, really, really meaty. I'm really passionate about it. So, a great bass drum sound. We're in a fantastic room here as well. So the drums, we're off to a winner straight away because the drums sound great in this room. This room really enhances, the bottom end of the drum. So the bass drum is the starting point for me. The bass drum is what anchors the whole thing. If it's a more contemporary session, it really fills the bottom end of the music. For the drummer, for me, is the goalkeeper of the band. We're at the back, we're at the bottom, we're holding it all together, and the bass drum is really the instrument which lies at the bottom of the band.
And so what is it? Is it a marching bass drum tradition? Is that where it's evolved from?
I guess so, actually. It's tribal, isn't it? We talk about groove. And I was thinking, I had a conversation with a friend of mine about 10 years ago. I said, what is it about dance music? And he said something which, because I just think for me it was just repetitive music, the bass drum mainly. He said to me, that is tribal. That is the thing that gets you. That is the groove that gets you. The great groove in all music for me, is coming from the bass drum. It's tribal. And it's the only way I can describe it.
And I believe the pedal was developed in the 1920s because it used to be called a kick drum because people would kick it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, this is, things have progressed. We're in a lovely studio today, so thankfully my bass drum pedal is not squeaking and destroying the recording. But, this is just beautiful. One of the things people say about how do I tune the instrument as well. So this bass drum specifically now is a 20 by 16 maple bass drum. Maple as a wood is fairly soft, and that's my preference. At the moment, it changes, but at the moment I'm enjoying playing these drums. 20 by 16. I don't have a hole in the front of the bass drum. Some people use a hole in the head on the front. Today, for this bass drum, the front head is tuned a little higher, and it's got a felt strip on it. The back head here, the batter head, is what they call a Remo Power Stroke 3 head, which is a twin ply head with a little self muffling ring all around the edge on the inside of the head. And there's no dampening in the bass drum either. So what it is actually giving me is a little bit of, it's tuned really, really down. I've got quite a nice sort of sub quality to it as well. It takes a little bit of getting used to with the bass drum technique, in as much as I can't bury the beater into the bass drum. I play off of it. But it's got a really nice sub sound as well. It really works well for, I like it. It's comfortable to play when you talk about tuning an instrument. Okay, so the bass drum pedal works by means of the pedal activating a beater through a chain drive mechanism. Drummers play two different techniques on the bass drum, heel up or heel down. I mentioned earlier that the bass drum has no hole in the front of it. So you've got to be slightly wary of burying the beater into the batter head, because you can get a sort of, the sound's not brilliant. That's burying the head. But if you play off of it, you get more sub and a cleaner note.
So that's allowing the beater to come back off.
Yeah, and I'm playing that with my heel down. Different drummers throughout history have played different techniques. I play both. If I'm playing quicker around the toms, I'll generally, with the bass drum, generally play heel up. So a couple of different techniques you can use. I have a double bass drum pedal here, which simulates having two bass drums, although my advice is to be very, very wary about where you use this, because this can really obliterate the bottom end of any band. So you've got to be careful. Mainly used for me for soloing ideas or the end of pieces of music with the long sustained chord. So I've got double bass drum pedal as well, which obviously you get sort of more faster drum kind of thing, bass drum fills almost. So
believe John Bonham used a double kick for one concert, and Jimmy Page banned him from ever using it ever again.
Oh, really?
Yes, that's
I didn't know that. Yeah, I know that Bonham played that great kind of triplety bass drum feel.
And that you're using the actual momentum of the mechanism there.
Yeah, what I'm doing is sliding my foot along the beater to get 2 strokes. Yeah. It's not so much about, it's what sounds good, of course, but for me it's also what feels nice to play. Yeah, it's important.
Excellent. Should we move on to the next one up, which is the snare drum?
The snare drum, of course, yeah. And this is an interesting one, isn't it? You know, we talk about the difference between British and American audiences. You know, English audiences tend to clap on the 1 and the 3. That, in contemporary music, is where the bass drum lands. American audiences clap on the 2 and 4. And that's where the snare drum lands. So we get the 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. That goes back, to the 50s, doesn't it? Well, earlier than that with the jazz guys, but that's what we hear, isn't it? The low note, the high note, the low note, the high note. 1, 2. So the snare drum, different ways of tuning it, of course.
Do you want to explain that? Obviously, it's quite an interesting. The components of the snare drum. What gives it its very kind of specific sound?
Okay, well let's if we can, let's take the snare drum off of the cradle stand, and you'll see this snare drum then it's called a Yamaha sensitive snare drum. It's kind of irrelevant because a lot of the snare drums, snare drums are all the same, basically, aren't they? This is a wood shell snare drum, which is the fundamental characteristic. Snares on the bottom of the drum, this snare head here is a very, very thin head that allows these snares to resonate when I play the drum. So it's the snare wires on the bottom of the drum which are making a difference. On top of the snare drum is a Remo Ambassador drum head. I've heard it being said before that 80% of the sound of the drum is the drum head. Particularly true, I think, with the toms. But that 20% does make the difference, obviously, with the wood. This is a Remo Ambassador snare drum head, and it's a single ply head. Single ply works better for me, certainly in this studio, in this studio environment where everything is close mic'd. So, I don't play particularly hard, so I don't really get through a lot of drum heads. But
it would be interesting to hear the drum without the snare on.
Sure.
It essentially becomes a side drum, doesn't it?
Exactly, yeah. Okay, so we have 2 different sounds with the snare drum, of course. We have the snare drum sound, and when we release the snares, we get this sound. And also, we play rim shots as well, which means that I'm playing the rim and the snare drum together. And I also, for me, when I play a big backbeat, I turn the stick around and I use this side of the drum stick. So we play a backbeat. So hitting this microphone here, but we get a different sound when we turn the stick around as well, and we get a big meaty sound when we're playing the rim and the head together.
So you call that rim shot. Then
rim shot.
If you're playing without the rim shot, what's that called?
Okay, that's just a snare beat. It's just a normal snare hit. Raval's Bolero. A marching beat.
Great. And I believe there's also a side stick method as well?
Of course, yeah, there is. And there's this sound.
Fantastic. Should we move along to what you called the sock drum?
Well, sock cymbals.
Sock cymbals,
the
yes.
hi-hats, yeah. Hi-hats also. So for me, really, in contemporary music, the big 3, the bass drum, the snare drum, the hi-hat. the hi-hat carries the interior notes, doesn't it? And one of the things that is really important for me is, I'm a right-handed drummer, and it's interesting, isn't it, that we've always been taught that the right hand is playing on the hi-hat, which I'm not sure it makes sense really, because obviously we can play the open-handed method with the left hand on the hi-hat. This is more comfortable for me now, and this is more the widely accepted way. But the hi-hat, absolutely. The hi-hat carries the groove. But there's something else that I add to it with a little bit of spice, and this is one of the things which Bernard Purdie, great fan of his playing, great groove drummer, a great session drummer, played on a ton of records. I play the snare drum ghost notes in conjunction with the hi-hat to get a nice forward motion, to get a feel that is actually carrying the music forward. Because for me, just to play is fine. It's a basic groove, sure, that's what we learn, but it's not really that inspiring. We can actually play some interior notes in conjunction with the hi-hat, and we get a bit more spice to the groove.
And you're just kind of literally bouncing the stick.
Just literally
on the
bouncing
snare.
ahead. Yeah, they're bouncing a stick. There's that lovely Steve Gadlick, which really highlights this, where you're using the hi-hat and snare drum in comparison. It's always related to Steve, the way this feel. The great track Chucky's in Love. Chucky's there's a shuffle feel, and there's a drum fill in there that Steve plays, which is hi-hat and snare drum very quietly, the ghost notes, which goes like this. And that's all he does. And you'll see we're getting a forward feeling with the music because we're combining two quiet notes, which is giving.
Fantastic. Can we just go back a step and just talk about the hi-hat, what it is, where it comes from, and how it works?
So the hi-hat, there's various different ways. Let's go back to the jazz days then. The jazz, the typical. Buddy Rich. Okay, so there's different ways of playing a hi-hat, of course. That's a jazz beat, which uses all of the components, the foot.
So what is it? It's two cymbals.
It's two cymbals. So these are 14-inch hi-hats, which is pretty much the industry standard size. I mean, some people use bigger hi-hats. At one stage, people use smaller hi-hats. Two cymbals together. Heavier cymbal on the bottom, lighter cymbal on the top is the general way. So I can play it with my foot.
How is that? It's basically it's a cable.
It's a cable. So there's literally just the thin tubing that goes all the way down to the bottom foot board. That's how I'm controlling that sound. So if I'm playing a jazz ride cymbal pattern, I'll play the foot hi-hat along with the ride cymbal. Let's see how that sounds. So the hi-hat is played on beats 2 and 4 in the jazz ride cymbal pattern, which favours the 2 and 4. That's generally 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. So the hi-hat can be played with the foot. The hi-hat can be played with the stick. The hi-hat can be splashed with the foot as well, different sound. And the hi-hat can obviously be splashed or played an open hi-hat sound with the stick as well. In a contemporary format. The jazz. So this is the real, this is the instrument that in the background really carries the time and carries the momentum of the drum groove.
And I believe with kind of rock drums, it's very much played much more. It can be played very open.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Let's look at a rock feel. Look at Ringo.
And in the funk style, it can be very much part of the kind of vocabulary of where you are in the bar. You know, that occasional open hi-hat that's choked. And
Absolutely. There was different car wash, you know, the old 70s groove track. Which kind of is where the dance feel comes from in electronic music.
But even kind of earlier than that, the very much the kind of the meters stuff where it's tight and closed, and then just occasionally the
real funky kind of the offbeat semiquaver feel.
Fantastic. So shall we move on to the tom-toms, which I believe were a later addition to the drums?
They're a later addition,
and they're from China. Is that correct? I think that.
Do you know what? That's a really good question. I'm not entirely sure, but they embellished the music, and there's a really funny.
And they were what would be called traps, weren't they? The kind of additional.
Yeah, exactly. The additional bits, and of course, this was the funny. There's a bass player friend of mine. We always laughed together because I went through a stage. We did the sound check, and of course, I just spoke about the big three: the bass drum, the snare drum, and the hi hat. But after every sound check, I'd always say, "How did the toms sound?" And I say, "Well, why are you bothered? You know, you hardly play them anyway." But everyone's got a big thing about the tom sound. We're talking about rack toms then on the drum set and floor toms. I use 4 tom-toms on this drum set: 10x7, 12x8, 14x13. And 16 by 15. I've got a little bit of what we call moon gel, which is a little way of dampening the drum rather than using the old days we used to use gaffer tape. This moon gel works really nice, and it takes, in the studio environment, the desk, the microphones, pick up everything. So it's quite nice here that the drums are sounding great straight away. The drum heads are quite old. They've got their own, which is my preference at the moment. They've got their own. I'm a bit loath to change the drum heads. I don't want to go for that sharp, bright sound again because these drums are nice. They're quite dull, but they've got their own sort of dampening or their own muting inherent in the fact that the drum heads are quite old. They sound quite nice. I quite like the sound of these. These are the toms. And with the whole set together, when we incorporate the bass drum, we rather than getting a linear line of notes together with no volume or with no what we call dynamics, no peaks, no lows, add the whole thing together and we get some nice sounds. These toms are great for me. Some people use one rack tom, some people use one floor tom. I choose to use the two. This works well for me. I'm comfortable with this. Is what I was brought up using. So compare everything together or put everything together, it all works really well.
Toms are traditionally used as part of fills, but you do get kind of beats using them as well, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Buddy Rich and
yeah. Let's go back to Gene Krupa. He was playing the floor tom in the Benny Goodman piece of music, Sing, Sing, Sing. And you remember this from when the drummers were Hollywood stars. They were at the front of the stage. They were on camera playing. Very, very in vogue in the day.
Fantastic. Final thing to end with is there's an array of cymbals,
Yeah.
and I believe these are historically these are Turkish descent.
That's Turkish and Chinese, in fact.
Okay.
So you might have got the impression already, I'm quite an equipment geek, actually. And I was flying to Los Angeles recently, taking this very set of cymbals. Now, this cymbal set has evolved actually fairly recently. I can't say it's that old, but these are cymbals that have been with me now for possibly about the last 8 years. And I've used them on pretty much everything. They are part of me. When I flew to Los Angeles, I was told that my cymbals hadn't made it onto the aeroplane. And I was so worried. I said, well, do you know what? I'll get on the next flight then, because these are so important to me. You know, this is really part of me. This is the part of the drum set that is irreplaceable. You know, if I lose one of these cymbals, you know, they're lost for good. You know, very difficult to replace, and I'm so comfortable with them. Again, I love Jeff Hamilton's quote, actually, which again I know is very subjective, but it did make me smile at the time when he said, "Beware of the drummer with the shiny cymbals." Yeah, I know this one is kind of shiny on the bottom, but it's certainly a dull finish on top. It's been well played. So these are Zildjian cymbals, and we mentioned earlier on about the fact that the origins were in Turkey. Well, of course, Zildjian cymbals, a Turkish company. The cymbals that I'm using are pretty much irreplaceable. So just to walk you around the cymbals that I'm using here, let's start with the hi-hat cymbals. These are really dry, actually, and you'll notice that the finish on the cymbals is actually quite dull. It's almost as if there's been no sort of lathing at all to make them shiny. But they're very dry. In fact, these cymbals are specifically called custom special dry K cymbals. So they're hand hammered. So they are hammered, but they're also very dry. And I've got a great stick definition, which I personally really like. And they're part of me. That's my sound. This is a 16-inch A cymbal. Now, in the Zildjian range, A means that they're machine hammered. And I use very few of these, but this cymbal is one actually that has been discontinued, sadly. But it is so thin. Every time I play it, I'm thinking, oh my God, please don't crack or get damaged. But it's just a beautiful sounding cymbal. You'll notice
that's a crash cymbal.
That's a crash cymbal. Yeah, exactly. So that is for punctuating various parts of the music. One thing about crash cymbals I should mention as well is that generally, as a generalization, they will always be backed up with the bass drum beat to reinforce the crash cymbal sound. Now, very rarely would you have, because we're back to that problem of sounding thin again. You know, we want this full range of sound. Yeah. So that's a real favorite, and that's a 16-inch A cymbal. So let's move around to here then. Slightly more personal choice for me is I'm using what is called a Kerepi cymbal, and this is a new range from Zildjian, but it's a reinvention of real reissue of the very first old K cymbals. All drummers go crazy about old K cymbals, really, and of course there's good ones and there's bad ones, but you find a really good one. Drummers like Tony Williams in the 60s really brought them to prominence. This has got 3 rivets in it. It's a ride cymbal, but it works well as a crash as well for heavier applications. Sounds like this.
So when you talk about ride and crash, the difference is the ride is kind of doing a similar job to the hi-hat.
It is. It's doing carrying the feel, and it's more associated, certainly in the time feel, with the jazz genre.
I can see with this cymbal, there's something creating what's referred to, I believe, as a sizzle.
That's right, yes, a sizzle. And there's 3 rivets in this cymbal here. And what they're doing is they're just allowing the cymbal to decay as a lot longer. The sustain. That's, you know, it works well. I really like it. It's something which I've actually throughout my whole career actually I've always used a ride cymbal in this position, more going back to the jazz side of things. But for me, that's where I was brought up, and this, you know, I love it. No matter what I'm doing, I use this cymbal. It's fantastic. If we carry on now over to the right hand side again, my right, your left. This is the K Custom medium ride cymbal. Now you'll notice on the bottom that it hasn't been lathed, it's just been polished. But the top has been lathed, and by lathing I mean it's got the ridges all the way around it like a record. Still quite a controlled cymbal. This is better for me for heavier applications because the cymbal has more definition and it sounds like this. And also it has another sound which we call the bell sound. In certain applications I can also crash the ride cymbal. I also do another interesting thing, which is something which I know it's been done by many people, but something I personally stole from Steve Gadd, which was laying the cymbal, laying the stick onto the cymbal, and you get this sort of sound really nice when you play, you know, the Steve Gadd shuffle, which actually incorporates the hi-hat splashes as well. So we can lay the stick onto, and we can control the resonance. This specific cymbal actually I use for heavier applications, as I say, because it's got more definition. The whole band can hear it really defined amongst a 17-piece orchestra. For lighter applications, I use a K cymbal like this, which is in this position a 22-inch K cymbal. Now this is a 22-inch K custom medium ride.
I'd love to hear the bell in context.
Sure.
I'm a funketeer and I love an offbeat bell.
Sure, let's try that.
Excellent.
Let's move around to another cymbal which very rarely used today actually, and this is called a Chinese. This actual cymbal is an A cymbal, Zildjian 22-inch swish knocker, and it's got lots of rivets all around it to help the sustain. This cymbal can do two things. We can crash it or we can ride on it. Crashing it means we can really accentuate big parts of the music, big loud crashes when the Chinese really cuts through. Big cymbal, 22 inches. We can also ride on this cymbal so it can sustain a feel. Great drummers throughout history that made the Chinese famous. One name that springs to mind immediately is the great Mel Lewis, great big band drummer. Peter Erskine, my heroes, one of my teachers, uses this same cymbal as well. And it sounds like this. If I ride on a cymbal in a jazz scenario, it would sound like this. If I crash the Chinese cymbal, slightly heavier scenarios, it sounds more that way. And then, finally, another beautiful cymbal, which is another one from the re-release of the K Therapy range from Zildjian. This is an 18-inch crash cymbal. And again, we talk about the qualities that it has. It's a very thin cymbal. It gets out of the way quickly. It's also quite dark. So for me, it buries itself in the music nicely, really contrasts to the ride cymbals. And also, one thing that I have found is it works very nicely with this 16-inch crash. So together, they're, I've heard the expression harmonized. They work well together. So that is my cymbal setup, and I would be absolutely beside myself if I was to lose one of these cymbals. The day will come, no doubt, but these are just fantastic. They're part of me.
And do cymbals die?
Not really. For me, they get better.
Okay.
One other thing I should mention that incorporates, that is, important for a great cymbal sound, and that is stick selection. Now, the sticks that I'm using are Vic Firth, who possibly Vic, the late Vic now, who was such a wonderful person, who was the timpanist with the Boston Philharmonic Orchestra, but another one of the great, lovely people in our industry. Vic Firth, the most successful drumstick manufacturer of all time. This is a hickory drumstick, and it's an American classic 5A. Now, what creates the sound of the cymbal that I actually specifically like is the fact that this is a barrel tip. So it's a new stick. It's a barrel tip stick, and it actually creates more warmth for me for the cymbal. It's slightly more muffled, slightly more dry. Unfortunately, I haven't got another pair of sticks to show you, but the other type of tip that you would have is what we call an acorn tip. So it's usually an acorn or a barrel tip. And then 5A is basically the medium weight stick, not too heavy, not too light, but I've got little hands, and this fits quite well for me. So really happy. And this drum set, I've been playing it now for this exact setup with these drums. I fairly new the drums for about a year. Like any great instrument, these drums have become like an old pair of shoes, an old pair of jeans. They've become part of me, very comfortable, and I wouldn't change it. They're great.
Brilliant. Now, you've just shown us the sticks. There are a couple of other things that you can play drums with other than your hands. Do you have any kind of hot rods and
you
brushes?
bet. So let's talk about the lost art form in drumming, and that is the brushes. I've recently, I should say, that a lot of great brush players play what they call traditional grip. I've changed from playing traditional grip recently to match grip, and I've started to play brushes with match grip as well. It started to feel very strange, but bit by bit now, as time has progressed, it's a lot more comfortable. So I'm playing match grip with brushes now, and they can sound like this. You'll notice that the hi-hat is still playing on 2 and 4, and there's a little bit of feathering of the bass drum, giving that nice bottom end. We can play a stroke with the brush, or we can play a swish.
And they're just wire, is that correct?
So these are just wire brushes. Again, these are big for the heritage brushes. So yeah, it's literally just wire brushes.
And when you finish playing them, you can pull the wire into.
You can. That's it, and that protects the wires, because if you don't do that, of course, the wires can tend to bend, and you don't get such a great sound. But these are lovely brushes. Yeah, great. So those work really well. What else have I got in my armory? Of course, we have some mallets, which are very rarely in a drumstick application played on the toms, although you can do. You can get some nice sort of effects.
Really shows the pitch of the tuning. You can
yeah.
hear everything is very.
Okay, and then if we play, this is the most common application for mallets on the drum set, and that is for the big cymbal rolls, which sound a little bit like, or trills, sound a little bit like this. Big orchestral cymbal rolls.
I always get nervous when drummers take out mallets in gigs. It always means that you're going into a 20-minute jazz freeform section.
Exactly. You got it. Yeah. These are the hot rods. I don't really use them so much myself. I prefer the play sticks lightly. They get a better sound for me. But you can use them. They're certainly a quieter option to the sticks.
Moving on to theory and stuff and doing sessions, I'd say 50% of the drummers I've worked with read, 50% don't. You do. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, reading for me was something that I learnt right from my early days of playing, right from word go, actually. I had a fantastic drum teacher whose name is Malcolm Garrett, actually, who's one of the great drum teachers at the Conservatoire in Birmingham, teaching so many fabulous musicians there. He taught me to read from the word go, and that was something which for me was so important. I did a session recently in Los Angeles with Richard Niles and the big band, and the way Richard writes the music, interestingly, generally on a session these days, I don't get music to play. I have to kind of learn the piece, and I've got my own little shorthand that I can write out quickly, so I know what's happening, whether how many bars are in the bridge, the verse, chorus, or whatever. Then people will take it to the next level where they'll write what we call orchestrations. That's a bit more complicated, but that's my personal favorite, because that gives an indication then of what everybody else is doing, the figures and everything else. That's down to my interpretation in the music of how I want to then embellish what is going on, whether I want to play more busily, whether I feel that. But basically that gives me a bit more control. Richard, again, has a bit more control in his writing, in that he writes his drum parts pretty much like a transcription. So he writes every note that you play, and that can get a little bit more complicated. So particularly if the music's going fast and there's a lot of notes, it's like a spider's crawled all over your piece of paper. That was more challenging, and that took a little bit of learning as well. So there's three different ways really that in sort of modern day, session playing, and bearing in mind that session playing now is there's a lot less of it about than there was, years ago. But yeah, most of the time now I'm mainly asked to learn music on the morning and just do a quick cheat sheet of, what exactly is going on. And then we'll sort of talk about what feels good.
So people booking live drummers shouldn't be worried about not being able to write drum charts?
No, as long as they can learn the music, or send the music in advance. I mean, a lot of times now, if I'm learning a gig, people will send me an MP3 of the tracks. I'll learn it. And again, I'll do my own little cheat sheet, which is really simple. I just write 8 bars, verse, 8 bars, bridge, 8 bars, chorus, drum fill, whatever. And that gives me, again, a little bit like an orchestration, gives me the freedom. And I'll probably just give an indication of what kind of feel it is. Straight 8s, what the bass drum feel is doing. Or whatever.
You mentioned that obviously the session work has changed, and obviously the advent of digital recorders, Pro Tools, is also affecting the way people are dealing with drums in post-production. Have you any kind of comments on that?
Yeah, session drumming has changed an awful lot. Every time I do a session now, pretty much 99% of the time I'm asked to play along with a click, which is good. It keeps everybody together. You go back to the 70s, a lot of that stuff was recorded. They just switched the red light on and off you went. Today, I play along with a click, but there's the added issue now that people can manipulate every single note that you've played. There's a grid in Pro Tools that they can line up, which can be good and it can be bad. We alluded to it earlier on. I think you mentioned that once you start down that route, there's no going back. The whole thing has to be what we call quantized, and so everything is very even. I have my suspicions with that sometimes it ends up not really sounding like a live drummer, so you think, what was the point of that? Sometimes, might not even end up sounding like me. Other times, the beat is always in one place. You can't ever avoid where the beat is happening, but we can always play ahead or behind of it and create different kind of feelings in the music. And sometimes that's what we want to do as well, providing the whole band obviously are playing with you and it's sounding good. So today, the click is necessary. I make it my friend. There's times when you're really on it, when you're playing right on the click, where actually the click disappears. We call it burying the click. And you think, oh, where's the click gone? It's like it stops, but actually you're just so on it that you've actually obscured it from your hearing. So, which is an interesting phenomenon. But learn to play. When you're practicing, one really good tip is to practice everything. For me, I always practice with a metronome. I accept that, time is something which is so important. I am the timekeeper in the band. Everybody has a duty to play good time, but I have to play time, first and foremost, and put that feeling across to the other musicians. There's various different, we could talk for an hour about time playing, but certainly good advice for me is to play along with records. Jeff Porcaro, when he was growing up, I read an interesting interview with the late great with Jeff, when he was saying that he used to practice along with records. His father is a great drummer, Joe Porcaro, got him into technique, and he said, I really got sick of playing all these technical exercises. I just wanted to play time, and lo and behold, Jeff became one of the most recorded drummers in history. Huge loss to the industry when he went, but his contribution to music was phenomenal and made people very aware of the need to play great time.
For me, there is a kind of a culture with Pro Tools and these digital audio workstations of the producer as the auteur, if you will. And I wonder whether you have an opinion on just being asked to do another take, as opposed to, there seems to be an urgency in making music these days, which means we'll fix it in post. We won't concentrate on positioning the mic. We'll add a plug-in.
Yeah.
We'll do some time correction. Don't need to worry about getting the take right.
Yeah, that's right. So, that basically means that anybody can show up and play drums, and it doesn't really matter, and no one really cares. And I get really sad about that, actually. You go back to some of the great drummers in history. Some of those great drum takes, I keep forgetting. Michael McDonald, great track. Jeff Porcaro was the drummer on that track. Jeff was even saying that he dropped the drumstick at one part in there, and you can hear the little thing going on with the bass drum and hi-hat. But the feeling is just so sublime that actually it's just great. It's art. That's what it is. It's just music, and it's so beautiful, and it's so wonderful.
He's on Thriller, isn't he? I think his work on Thriller is phenomenal because it's so straight, but yet the groove is so phenomenal.
Yeah, exactly.
And you think it's a drum machine, but it's him on top of a...
It's him. Yeah, great time feel. But it goes beyond just playing great time for me. It's a great feel. It's what you put across. It's what you give to the music. People can play great time, and play very accurately, and it can be like... they're flatlining. There's nothing going on. I want to play great time, but I want to put across a great feel that inspires the other musicians as well. I'm very, very skeptical when people start manipulating drum parts too much, really. I think certainly with the recording process now, I think it's very important that a lot of the time, I'm hired and I'll play along with MIDI tracks of music that someone's written, and I'm the first person to go down on that music. So I believe that it's a bit like building a house. We have a solid foundation, great big skeleton that's really solid of drums. Everybody else can put the nice bits to it, play bass along with it, and it gets, we'll build a really lovely feeling. If you don't start with the drums, and I start replacing drums that have been on there before, or I start trying to make things sound good that perhaps time-wise are a little bit iffy, problems start. So I think you've got to be very disciplined with the recording process, particularly if you're recording at home. I think it's very important for me in modern music, contemporary music, where you're playing a groove, it's important to start with the drums, because the drums are the real skeleton. They're the bones. It's a bit like a human being without a skeleton. What are you left with?
And when you're invited into a session and you're confronted with a temp programmed drum kit, are there any common mistakes people make which kind of make it, one, not sound like a drum kit because it's not what a drum kit does. And two, you have to go, well, it's going to be one or the other. Is there?
That's true. That happens a lot, actually. And I've heard people who have programmed drum parts and said, can you play this or can you play that? And actually, it's humanly impossible because I don't have 4 arms.
Right.
It's been very, very difficult. You need to think like a drummer. And I quite like it some of the time when guys have written pieces of music, but they've used the loop, which is played by a live drummer. And straight away then we can actually hear the feeling that they want to put across, because a lot of the time it'd be a little bit like me recording or writing for a piano player or a bassist. A piano player might say, well, I haven't got 20 fingers, 20 fingers, I can't play all that in one go.
So, I mean, the common mistakes being big tom fills whilst a hi-hat, complicated hi-hat part's going, that kind of thing.
That's a good point. Yeah, exactly. I would rather... I've been studying drums, and it is a lifetime study for 30 years. So I like it when, I think the biggest compliment is when people leave the drums quite sparse. They show up and say, just do your thing. That's the biggest compliment, isn't it? When people actually recognize, what you do. When we showed up today, you'll notice that I had a big smile on my face as soon as I played the drums. I mentioned that these drum heads are quite old, but there's something about this drum set that sounds good. I know it's a great sounding drum set, but when I played them in this room, they're enhanced again. So I knew that we were in for a good day of recording because this room is just amazing. I can't explain the quality of it. There's something velvety about the drums. There's something very high quality about the sound that we're creating. But this room straight away is a beautiful, beautiful room. So yeah, having a great room to record in straight away is so important. Great sounding drum set, great sounding room, great engineer. You're going to have a good day.
I have just one final question, and this may be putting you on the spot in. For someone who's grown up with modern computerized music, time corrected, close mic'd drums, wanting to discover some drum tracks that really inspire them, have you got 2 or 3 favourite examples of what makes a great live drummer?
Oh, sure. People who have influenced me are certainly my 2 teachers, 3 teachers, but certainly Joe Morello and Peter Erskine. If you go back to Dave Brubeck, that great track, Take 5, Joe Morello played a drum solo on that, they called it the Hit Parade at the time, that went to #1, and that was one of the few pieces which had actually featured a drum solo as a #1 single. So I love that. There's a great album that I've been listening to, which was Dave Brubeck live at Carnegie Hall, and this features Joe Morello. Particularly check out a piece called Castilian Drums. I think one of the finest, most musical drum solos I've ever heard. And at the time, Joe was actually suffering with a fever, and he was really quite ill when he played that concert, but it was actually some of the finest jazz drumming I've heard. If we fast forward now to some of my favorite musicians of the modern era, I still go back to Jeff Porcaro. I still go back to Steve Gadd as one of my favorites. Great groove drummers. Keith Carlock. Check Keith Carlock out. Very, very current at the moment. There's Adam Dietz is another drummer that I'm a great fan of. I was listening to an album that he played on with John Scofield, the great guitarist. There's so much great music out there now. I have a slight concern, there's so much music out there now that, we miss so much, that it's a very different world with people able to listen to music streamed for nothing. So it's both a benefit and it's also causes its own fair share of problems as well. I think it destroys the industry as much as it gives everybody the opportunity to listen to great music. So Steve Gadd is still a great favourite. If I go back to, there was a young student of mine about 7 years ago was taking part in a sort of drum competition, and he was very upset that he didn't win the competition. And I said, well, it's all subjective. Music is not a competition. It's all very subjective. If you were to put Tony Williams, Buddy Rich, and Steve Gadd on stage, who would win? He couldn't answer the question because it's all subjective. So I think we've all got something to offer. And, I think in the music industry, as the great Steve Gadd said, we're all in this together. We should all enjoy, what everybody's got to offer. This is art. It's not a sport.
Ian, thank you so much.
Thank you.